I spent years trapped in an abusive marriage until I found my mother-in-law's diary, revealing the truth about the man who was manipulating me. Her phrase echoed, "Bring justice?" What no one imagined is that I'd have the courage to expose everything, but to understand how I got to this moment, how I found strength I didn't even know I had. You need to hear the story from the beginning. You need to understand what really happened in that house in Maple Creek, Kentucky, and how a diary hidden under a filthy mattress would change, not just my life, but reveal secrets that no one, absolutely no one, was prepared to discover. You know that moment when you can finally breathe after years of holding your breath? Well, that's exactly how I felt when I stepped onto the shoulder of that dirt road in Maple Creek, Kentucky. My heart was still beating irregularly, not from the exhausting trip, but from the weight of having left behind years of manipulation, of words that hurt more than any slap, of empty promises that echoed through the house like ghosts. Mikael Turner, my husband, or ex-husband, as I needed to get used to thinking, had transformed me into a shadow of who I was. That strong and determined woman I once was had gotten lost somewhere between the screaming, the baseless accusations, and the absolute control he exercised over every aspect of my life. But something inside me, maybe a last remnant of sanity, told me I needed to go to that house, the house of his elderly mother, Mrs. Rose Turner, the only person who always treated me with genuine kindness in that family. And it was precisely thinking of her that my heart tightened when I spotted the wooden structure in the distance, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to guard ancient secrets. The house was different from what I remembered. In the few moments when Michael allowed me to visit her, always under his watchful eye, always with time clocked, the place had a welcoming air, with floral curtains swaying in the window and the smell of apple pie that Mrs. Rose insisted on making every time we had visitors. Now, before my eyes, stood a ghostly structure, with shutters hanging crooked, paint peeling in large patches revealing the gray wood underneath. The garden that my mother-in-law loved so much was completely abandoned, with weeds growing wildly and invading even the front porch. Michael always said he took care of his mother with all care, that he visited weekly, that he guaranteed she had everything of the best until her final days. "My mother died in peace, Sarah," he repeated whenever I asked about her, with that tone of voice that didn't allow questioning. But looking at that abandoned house, at those foggy windows that seemed not to have seen sunlight in months, something very wrong screamed in my mind. I walked slowly to the front door, my steps making the old boards of the porch groan under my weight. The key, I had a copy that Mrs. Rose had given me years ago, hidden from Michael, in a gesture that at the time seemed just affectionate but now was beginning to make sense in a frightening way, still worked in the rusty lock. I pushed the door and a heavy odor hit me like a wave. Mold, dampness, something indefinable that made my stomach turn. The air inside the house was still stale, as if no one had opened a window in months, maybe years. The living room, which was once cozy with its floral fabric, armchairs, and family photographs on the walls, was now covered by a thin layer of dust that danced in the rays of light that managed to penetrate through the dirty curtains. Objects were scattered chaotically, magazines stacked crookedly, a half-full glass of water next to the couch, a blanket thrown on the floor as if someone had run out of there. There was nothing of that care Michael swore he'd given his elderly mother. Nothing of that attention that a devoted son would have. I advanced through the house with my heart increasingly accelerated, each room revealing more signs of abandonment and negligence. The kitchen had dirty dishes piled in the sink, dark stains on the walls that seemed to have been caused by untreated infiltration. The floor with marks of old dirt that no broom had touched for a long time. How was it possible that Michael said he had taken care of her until the end? How did he dare repeat that emotional story of a dedicated son who sacrificed his time to guarantee his mother's comfort? My hands trembled as I opened drawers, looking for, well, I didn't even know exactly what, maybe some proof that I was wrong, that there was a reasonable explanation for all of that. But deep dome in that place where the truth lives, even when we try to ignore it, I already knew. I already felt it in my goosebumps, in the tightness in my chest, in the growing nausea. Michael had lied about everything. And if he lied about taking care of his own mother, what else had he lied about? The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own steps and labored breathing that I could barely control. I remember stopping in the middle of the room, looking around as if seeing everything for the first time, and a memory hit me. Mrs. Rose, sitting in that same armchair that was now covered with stain, holding my hand with her wrinkled but warm hands, saying with those kind eyes, "Sarah dear, you have a pure heart. Don't let anyone extinguish that in you." At the time, I thought it was just the affection of a caring mother. Now, those words resonated with a totally different meaning. She knew. Somehow, Mrs. Rose knew the type of man her son was. She knew about the control, the manipulation, maybe even sensed what he was capable of doing. And she had tried to warn me the only way she could, with soft words that wouldn't awaken Michael's fury if he heard them. I climbed the creaky stairs that led to the second floor, each step protesting under my weight as if revealing its own secrets. The upper hallway was even darker than downstairs, with only a small window at the end allowing a weak beam of light to enter. There were 4 doors, 3 of them ajar, revealing rooms in various states of abandonment. I entered what was clearly Mrs. Rose's room. I recognized the antique dresser she loved so much, the patchwork quilt she had sewn herself. But something was terribly wrong there too. The drawers were turned over, clothes scattered on the floor, empty drawers as if someone had looked for something in a hurry, or as if someone had taken everything of value and left only the rest. The bed was without sheets, the mattress stained and sunken in the middle. No ungrateful son would leave his own mother's room in that state. No minimally decent human being would do this to someone they loved. That's when I saw the 4th door. Unlike the others, this one was completely closed, and there was something strange about it that immediately caught my attention. I approached slowly, as if my body already knew that what I would find there would change everything. The doorknob was dirty, with fingerprints that seemed to have been made by someone trying to open it repeatedly. But what really made me stop was the latch on the outside, a new latch, shiny, completely clashing with the rest of the old house. Why would someone put a latch on the outside of a door? The only reason that came to mind made my blood freeze in my veins. That wasn't to keep something out. It was to keep someone inside. My trembling hand reached the latch, and when I pulled it, I heard the metallic click echoing through the silent hallway like a shot. The door opened slowly, revealing a darkness that seemed to have substance, weight, history. The smell that came out of that room was worse than anything I had felt until then. Stale air, old sweat, something sweet and nauseating that spoke of illness, of suffering, of absolute abandonment. I felt along the wall looking for the switch, and when I finally found it and the weak light from the bulb illuminated the room, I had to hold on to the doorframe to keep from falling. The room was small, much smaller than the others, almost a storage room transformed into a bedroom. There were no windows, absolutely no source of natural ventilation. A thin, stained mattress was thrown on the floor, without a pillow, without a sheet, with an old blanket rolled up in a corner. Next to it, a plastic tray with dried remains of what was once food. On the opposite wall, marks, scratches, as if someone had tried to dig an exit with their own nails. And suddenly, everything made a horrible and crystalline sense. Mrs. Rose hadn't died in peace, cared for by her loving son. She had been locked in there, in that cubicle, without air, without natural light, without dignity. My legs weakened and I leaned against the wall, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to understand the depth of cruelty necessary to do something like this to one's own mother. How many nights did she spend there, alone, calling for help that would never come? How many times did she bang on that door, begging to be freed? And where was I while this was happening? Trapped in my own prison, blind to the manipulation of a man I now understood to be a true monster. The tears began to fall without me being able to control them, not just from the horrible discovery, but from the guilt that consumed me. I should have noticed, should have questioned more, insisted on seeing Mrs. Rose, not accepted Michael's excuses that she was too tired for visits or going through a difficult phase. The total humiliation of having been deceived so completely hit me with devastating force. But there, in that room that held terrible secrets, something stronger than guilt began to grow inside me. An iron determination, an urgent need to discover the whole truth. Because if Michael was capable of doing this to his own mother, what else was he hiding? And more importantly, how could I make him pay for all of this? I took a deep breath, wiped the tears with the back of my hand, and entered the room completely. There had to be something else there, some clue that would help me understand what really happened to Mrs. Rose. My eyes scanned every inch of that claustrophobic space, looking for something, anything, that could give me answer. And that's when my gaze landed on the stained mattress on the floor. There was something underneath it, a small but noticeable bulge that didn't match the flat surface of the floorboards. With my heart racing, I knelt beside the mattress and lifted it carefully, as if opening a tomb. And in a way, that's exactly what I was doing, because what I would find there would change everything, would change the way I saw my marriage, how I understood the last years of my life, and especially how I would see Michael Turner from that moment forward. Under the mattress, hidden like a last act of resistance from a desperate woman, was a notebook. A notebook with a faded blue cover, with edges worn by time and the humidity of that horrible room. I picked up that notebook with hands shaking so much I almost dropped it. It was light, surprisingly light for something that seemed to carry the weight of so many secrets. So much pain accumulated between its yellowed pages. The blue cover was stained, with fingerprints that seemed to have been made in a hurry, in desperation, as if the person who held it last knew they were leaving something important behind. I ran my fingers over the rough surface, feeling each imperfection, each fold, and a shiver ran down my spine from top to bottom. It wasn't just any premonition, it was that absolute certainty that sometimes we have, that inner voice that screams that your life is about to change completely. And I wasn't wrong, because when I opened the first page and saw the trembling handwriting, almost illegible in some places, of Mrs. Rose Turner, I felt as if the ground had opened beneath my feet. Those words, written with such difficulty, with letters that danced across the page, as if the hand writing them barely had the strength to hold the pen, told a story that no one should have to live. I sat right there on the cold floor of that room that had been my mother-in-law's prison, leaning against the damp wall that exuded that smell of mold that was already impregnated in my clothes, in my skin, in my soul. The weak light from the bulb flickered from time to time, threatening to leave me in the dark, but I barely noticed. My eyes were fixed on those first lines, on those words that seemed to have been torn from the chest of a woman who knew she was living her last days. If someone is reading this, the diary began. It means I couldn't get out of here. It means my son, my own son, got what he wanted. The pain in those words was palpable. I could feel each letter loaded with disappointment, fear, sadness so deep it seemed endless. How does a mother feel realizing that the son she raised, whom she loved unconditionally, was capable of such cruelty? How was it possible that Michael, that man who presented himself to the world as a dedicated son, present husband, exemplary citizen, had done this to his own elderly mother? I turned the page, my hands now firmer, moved by an urgent need to know the whole truth, no matter how painful it was. Mrs. Rose described the days before her imprisonment in that room, days when Michael began visiting her more frequently. Always with that fake smile I knew so well, always bringing papers for her to sign. He said there were simple documents, things related to the house, the bills, she wrote, the handwriting becoming even more irregular as if the memory physically disturbed her. But I realized something was wrong when he started talking about Sarah. He said she was influencing me, that she wanted my money, that you were manipulating me to change the will. The mention of my name made me stop breathing for a second. He had used my name, my existence, as a tool to manipulate his own mother. That ungrateful son had created a narrative where I was the villain, the gold digger daughter-in-law who wanted to take advantage of a vulnerable lady. And Mrs. Rose, poor thing, must have been so confused, so divided between love for the only person who treated her with genuine affection and the venomous accusations of her own son. I continued reading, each word cutting me like a sharp blade. When I refused to sign the papers without my lawyer present, everything changed, she narrated, and I could feel the growing fear in her writing. Michael was furious. Not that anger he showed as a child. No, it was something cold, calculated, frightening. He said I was becoming senile, that I no longer knew what was best for me, that he needed to protect me from myself. The next day, he came back with tools. I heard noise in the hallway, sounds of metal, of something being installed. When I left the room to see what was happening, he pushed me back and closed the door. I heard the latch being put on. I screamed, begged, banged on the door until my fists hurt. He Didn't respond. I just heard his footsteps going down the stairs and the front door closing. The horror of that description made me nauseous. I imagined Mrs. Rose, that gentle lady who always offered me tea and cookies, being pushed and locked like an animal by her own son. What kind of monster does that? The following pages were even more disturbing. Mrs. Rose described the routine that was established. Michael returned every few days, always at night, always alone. He brought cold food on plastic trays, water in bottles, and constantly pressured her about the documents. He showed me papers, told me that if I signed, everything would go back to normal, that I could leave that room, go back to living my life. She wrote, the letters shaking even more in those sections. But I read the documents when he left them once. They weren't just changes to the will. He wanted total control over everything. My house, my savings, even my retirement. And there were clauses that excluded me from any decision, that basically declared me incapable of managing my own life. Mrs. Rose's intelligence, even in such a desperate situation, filled me with painful admiration. She had understood exactly what Michael intended to do, legally transform her into a person without autonomy, while physically he already kept her prisoner. It was a meticulous plan from a man who didn't have an ounce of humanity. What shocked me most, however, was when Mrs. Rose began writing about me. Sarah, she noted on one of the pages with slightly firmer handwriting, as if gathering strength to leave that message. If you're reading this, you need to know some things. You were never the gold-digger daughter-in-law that Michael painted. On the contrary, you were the only person in this family who treated me like a human being, who genuinely cared about me, who didn't see me just as an inheritance waiting to be divided. I realized that from the first day you entered this house, nervous but with that sincere smile, bringing flowers you chose yourself because roses were too beautiful to be just my last name. I remember every visit of yours, every conversation, every time you held my hand and really listened to me. My tears fell on the pages as I read, blurring some of the already faded ink. Mrs. Rose saw in me what I myself had lost sight of during years of Michael's manipulation, that I had value, that I was capable of genuine kindness, that I wasn't the horrible person my husband insisted on saying I was. Michael was always jealous of that, she continued, and that hit me like a punch in the stomach. Jealous of the affection we had for each other, of the connection he never could understand because he was never capable of feeling something like that. He saw our relationship as a threat, as something that needed to be controlled or eliminated. That's why he started limiting your visits, creating excuses about why you couldn't see me. That's why he completely isolated me when he realized I intended to change my will to guarantee you'd get this house. Not because you asked, but because I wanted someone who really loved this place, who understood its history, to take care of it. The revelation left me breathless. Mrs. Rose wanted to leave me the house, not out of obligation, not through manipulation, as Michael always insinuated, but out of genuine love, out of recognition that I was the only person who really cared. And it was exactly because of that he locked her in that horrible room, out of greed, out of control, out of pure evil. The last pages of the diary were the hardest to read. The handwriting became increasingly weak, words sometimes repeating or remaining incomplete, clear signs that Mrs. Rose was losing her strength, her health deteriorating rapidly in that environment without ventilation, without natural light, without the medical care she obviously needed. I don't know how much time I still have, she wrote in one of the final entries. My body is giving up. The chest pain that already bothered me is worse, but Michael stopped bringing my medication. He says I don't need them, that I'm inventing symptoms to get attention. I'm so scared. Not of dying, I already know that's going to happen soon, but that he'll manage to make everything seem natural, accidental, that no one will ever know the truth about what he did. The despair in those words was suffocating, as if I could feel the weight of fear she carried in those final days. Alone, abandoned by her own son, with no one to hear her, to help her, to simply be there. And then, on the last written page, I found the words that would change everything. With almost illegible letters, shaking so much that some letters were just scribbled. Mrs. Rose had left her final message. Sarah, dear Sarah, if you find this diary, bring justice. Not just for me, my story has already ended, but for yourself. Michael is not just an ungrateful son. He's dangerous, manipulative, capable of terrible things. You deserve to be free from him, deserve to live without fear, without control, without this total humiliation he inflicts on everyone around him. Use these words, these proofs, and do what I didn't have the strength to do. Stop him before he destroys more lives. You have my blessing, my love, and all my support, even if I'm no longer here to say this personally. Be strong, my dear daughter-in-law. Be the courageous woman I always saw in you, even when you yourself couldn't see it. Bring justice. I closed the notebook with my hand shaking violently, the weight of those words, of that responsibility, of that horrible truth completely crushing me. Mrs. Rose had died alone, scared, suffering, betrayed by her own son, and I had in my hands the proof of all of that. The question now wasn't whether I would do something about it. It was how I would make Michael Turner pay for every second of suffering he caused. I don't know how long I sat there, holding that notebook against my chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And in a way, it was. It was the voice of a woman who had been silenced. It was the truth that Michael had tried to bury along with his mother. It was the irrefutable proof that everything I had lived through in recent years wasn't a product of my imagination or my exaggerated sensitivity, as he always said. The sun was beginning to set outside, and the orange rays entering through the small hallway window created long and distorted shadows on the walls of that cursed room. I needed to get out of there, breathe fresh air, process everything I had discovered, but at the same time, something held me in that space. Maybe it was the weight of the responsibility Mrs. Rose had placed on my shoulders. Maybe it was simply the paralyzing shock of understanding the depth of evil in the man I had shared a bed with for so many years. How had I not noticed? How does someone manage to hide so much cruelty behind such a perfect mask of normalcy? I forced myself to stand, my numb legs complaining about the time I'd spent sitting on that cold, dirty floor. I looked one last time at the room, memorizing every horrible detail, the marks on the wall, the filthy mattress, the tray with dried food, as if storing evidence not just in memory, but engraving those images in my soul. Because this couldn't be forgotten, couldn't be minimized or explained rationally. That was pure cruelty. It was the kind of evil you only see in movies or read about in news, stories about distant people, never imagining you're sleeping next to someone capable. I left the room, taking the notebook with me, going down the stairs carefully not to trip in my own mental confusion. The whole house seemed different now, each room loaded with new and sinister meaning. This wasn't just an abandoned house, it was a crime scene, a silent witness to one of the most cowardly acts one human being can commit against another, especially against their own elderly mother who gave them life. When I reached the living room, I let myself fall onto that dusty couch, not caring about the dirt sticking to my clothes. I opened the notebook again, this time looking for specific details that could help me understand not just what happened, but when and how. Mrs. Rose was meticulous. She noted dates, times, details of each of Michael's visits. March 15th, 1 entry read. Michael arrived at 11 p.m., as always, brought only water and 2 pieces of dry bread. Said I was eating too much and needed to. When I asked about my heart medications, he laughed, really laughed, as if it were a joke. Said I didn't need medication, that I was inventing illness to get attention. My chest hurts so much I can barely breathe, but he doesn't. The date hit me like lightning. March 15th was just 3 days after my birthday that year, the day Michael had organized a surprise party for me, inviting all our acquaintances, presenting himself as the perfect and attentive husband. While everyone toasted to our wonderful relationship, he was keeping his own mother in captivity, denying her food and essential medications. I continued flipping through, finding more and more evidence of Michael's systematic cruelty. In some entries, Mrs. Rose described the conversations he had with himself when he thought she was sleeping, disturbing monologues about how he would finally be free, about how that house was worth a fortune, and how he had big plans for the money. I heard him on the phone last night, she wrote in a particularly unsettling passage, talking to someone about investments, about as soon as the old woman signs he could really start living. He didn't refer to me as mother. It was the old woman, the problem, the obstacle. How can my son, the boy I raised, who I rocked in my arms when he cried, who I protected from all the dangers of the world, talk about me that way? The pain in those words was almost physical. as if I could feel Mrs. Rose's heart breaking into pieces every time she heard her son revealing his true nature. No mother should have to face the reality that she raised a monster. But what disturbed me most were the parts where Mrs. Rose talked about the deterioration of her health. She was extremely aware of what was happening to her body, describing each symptom with frightening clarity. My blood pressure must be very high. I feel my head throbbing constantly. My vision gets blurry. The chest pains are increasingly frequent and intense. I know I need medication. I know I'm having small heart attacks that, if not treated, will end up killing me. And Michael knows this too. It's not ignorance on his part. It's deliberate choice. He's letting me die slowly, and he does it with the clear conscience of someone who thinks they're just solving a problem. Mrs. Rose's lucidity, even in such desperate circumstances, was impressive. She knew exactly what Michael was doing, understood she was being murdered slowly, and still found the strength to document everything, to leave a record that could, one day, bring justice. This was a strong, courageous woman who refused to be forgotten or silenced even facing imminent death. There were also passages where she tried to understand, tried to find some explanation for her son's behavior. "I keep wondering where I went wrong," she wrote, in an entry loaded with guilt that broke my heart. "What did I do wrong in raising him? Did I give too much? Too little? Was I too harsh or too permissive? Where was the moment I could have changed the course of things, taught empathy, compassion, respect for human life? Or is it that some people are simply born without this capacity to truly care about others?" Michael was always different. Since childhood, he didn't cry when he saw others hurt, didn't show genuine remorse when he did something wrong, just got irritated at being caught. I thought it was a phase, that he would mature. How wrong I. Those words made me think about all the times Michael had demonstrated this same lack of empathy with me, when I cried and he rolled his eyes, when I was sick and he complained about the inconvenience, when I tried to share my concerns and he dismissed them as if they were insignificant. It wasn't lack of understanding. It was complete absence of the capacity to care. The diary also revealed Mrs. Rose's desperate attempts to ask for help. Today, when Michael opened the door to leave the tray, I tried to scream. I used all the strength I had to make my voice reach someone, anyone who might be passing on the street. He punched me in the stomach, not hard enough to leave a mark, but hard enough to knock the air out of me and leave me on the floor, coughing and struggling to breathe. When I managed to look up, I saw in his eyes ... nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not anger, not remorse, not recognition that he had just physically assaulted his own mother. It was like looking into a shark's eyes, cold, empty, calculating. He simply said, "Don't do that again," and closed the door. The description made me feel nauseous. Michael had hit his own elderly mother, and by the clinical tone of Mrs. Rose's description, that hadn't been the first or last time. How many times had he used physical violence to keep her submissive? How many times had he crossed lines that no decent human being would cross? I then found a section of the diary that left me particularly shaken. The unsent letters Mrs. Rose wrote to me. "Dear Sarah," one began, dated 2 months before her death. "I write this, knowing you'll never read it while I'm still alive. But I need to get these thoughts out before they consume me completely. I want you to know that I noticed what Michael does to you. I saw in your eyes that same fear that now lives permanently in mine. I saw how you shrink when he raises his voice, how you choose your words so carefully, as if you're always walking on eggshells, always trying to avoid an explosion you know will come anyway. I saw the long-sleeve clothes you wear even in the hottest summer. I saw the sunglasses inside the house. I saw everything you tried to hide, and my heart bled for you as much as it bleeds for me now." The tears returned to my face. Mrs. Rose had seen. She had understood, and probably that's exactly why Michael isolated her, because she was a witness, someone who knew his true nature and could, eventually, help me escape. "If you're reading this," the unsent letter continued, "it means he got what he wanted with me. It means I won't be able to be there for you physically, to offer the support I always wanted to give but never could because of the restrictions Michael imposed. But I want you to take these words as if they were my blessing, my final embrace, my last act of maternal love, because that's how I saw you, Sarah, as the daughter I never had, as the person who brought light to my final years before everything darkened. Bring justice, not just for me, but for yourself, for all the women who suffer in silence, for all the victims of men who hide behind masks of normalcy while destroying lives in the shadows. You're stronger than Michael made you. You're more capable, more intelligent, more courageous than he ever allowed you to know. Use that strength. Use these proofs. And don't let him win. Don't let my death be in vain. I closed the notebook again, this time with a determination I hadn't felt in years. Mrs. Rose was right. Michael had spent years convincing me I was weak, incompetent, incapable of surviving without him. But if I had found courage to leave him, to come to this house, to face these horrible truths, then I had enough strength to do much more. I had strength to guarantee that man would pay for every tear, every drop of suffering, every second of terror he caused, for Mrs. Rose, for me, for all the past and future victims of that monster who hid behind a charming smile and well-chosen words. Night had fallen completely over Maple Creek, and the house was plunged into a darkness that seemed to have its own texture, dense and heavy like a wet blanket. I turned on all the lights I could find working. There weren't many. Some bulbs had burned out and were never replaced. More proof of Michael's neglect, but each point of light was a small relief against the oppression of that place loaded with terrible memories. I knew I needed to leave there, seek help, do something concrete with the information I had discovered. But something told me there was more, that Mrs. Rose's diary was just the tip of a much larger and more sinister iceberg. So, ignoring the exhaustion that was beginning to weigh on my shoulders, I began to search the house more systematically, opening drawers, cabinets, dusty boxers that were stacked in forgotten corners. If Michael had hidden the truth about what he did to his mother, what other truths was he hiding? What other secrets were buried between those walls that witnessed so much suffering? It was in Mrs. Rose's old study, a small room on the ground floor that she used to take care of the house finances, that I found the first unsettling clue. Inside a drawer that initially seemed to contain only old bills and unimportant receipts, my hand touched something different, a thick, brown envelope with a rubber band holding it already dried out by time. I opened it carefully, and dozens of receipts fell out, all meticulously organized by date. At first glance, they seemed like normal expenses, pharmacy, supermarket, gas stations. But it was when I started looking more closely that the strange details began to jump out at me. All the receipts were signed on the back, and the name that appeared repeatedly in a firm and feminine handwriting that definitely wasn't Mrs. Rose's was Veronica Hale. Who the hell was Veronica Hale? Why was she signing receipts for purchases that supposedly were for Mrs. Rose? And why would Michael keep all this so organized if he didn't have anything to hide? I spread the receipts over the dusty table, organizing them by date as if assembling a macabre puzzle. A pattern began to emerge, clear and disturbing. The dates of the purchases coincided perfectly with the periods when Michael said he was taking care of his mother. I remembered him leaving the house with that dedicated son expression, sighing dramatically about the sacrifice of spending entire weekends in Maple Creek, about how exhausting it was to care for an elderly person. I, idiot that I was, even felt guilty for not being able to help more, for not being understanding enough with his needs. But those receipts told a completely different story. The pharmacies weren't in Maple Creek, they were in Louisville, more than 100 kilometers away. The supermarkets, the gas stations, everything was from Louisville. Michael wasn't taking care of Mrs. Rose on those weekends. He was in Louisville with this Veronica, spending money that probably came from his own mother's accounts. The total humiliation of discovering this, of understanding I had been deceived so completely, burned inside me like acid. I picked up one of the pharmacy receipts and examined it more closely. There was a list of medications, some names I vaguely recognized from TV commercials, others completely unknown. I pulled out my cell phone, thank God it still had battery, and started searching for each medication list. My stomach turned when the results started appearing. Ritalin for ADHD, insulin for diabetes, a bronchodilator for asthma. None of these medications had any relation to Mrs. Rose's health problems. She didn't have diabetes, didn't have asthma, definitely didn't have ADHD. So who were these medications for? The answer came when I found, in the same envelope, a receipt from a pediatric clinic in Louisville, dated 3 years ago. The appointment was for Brian Hale, 8 years old, and the doctor had prescribed exactly the same medications that appeared on the pharmacy receipt. Brian Hale. The last name was the same as the woman who signed the receipts, and if he was 8 years old 3 years ago, now he must be 11. The perfect age for a son, for someone's son. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped my phone when the understanding finally hit me with full force. Michael had another son, a son he kept completely secret in another city with another woman. It wasn't just an occasional affair. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a complete double life, meticulously built and maintained for years. While I lived in our apartment in Lexington, believing we were a couple, albeit dysfunctional, Michael was building an entire family in Louisville, with Veronica, with Brian. How many times did he say he was working late or visiting his mother when he was actually having dinner with, taking the boy to the doctor, doing grocery shopping like a normal family man? How many lies did he tell? How many elaborate stories did he create to keep his two worlds separate? And the worst part, he was using the money that should have been spent on caring for Mrs. Rose to support this second family. He left his own elderly mother locked in a filthy room without medication, while guaranteeing his secret son had everything he needed. I kept digging through that cursed envelope, finding more and more evidence of Michael's parallel life. There were photos, not many, but enough to make me feel like I'd taken a punch in the stomach. Michael with a beautiful blonde woman, both smiling in a park. Michael with a dark-haired boy, obviously Brian, both wearing matching shirts of a baseball team. A birthday photo with a cake that said "Happy Birthday, Brian." And Michael in the background, cutting the cake like the proud father he never was with me, could never be with me because, well, we had decided not to have children, or rather, he had decided, and I, as always, had accepted his decision without questioning. "We're not ready financially," he said. "We need to focus on our career," he insisted. But the truth was, he already had a son, already had the family he wanted. I was just... what? The official wife? The facade of respectability? The convenient idiot who paid half the bills while he diverted money to his real life in Louisville? Among the photos, I found even more revealing documents. School records for Brian Hawley, listing Michael Turner as father financial guardian. Rental contracts for an apartment in Crescent Hill, a nice Louisville neighborhood, with Michael as guarantor and Veronica as primary tenant. Even a life insurance policy where Brian was the beneficiary. Michael had created a complete infrastructure for this secret family, guaranteeing they were safe, comfortable, protected, while I lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing when the next explosion of rage would come, the next period of silent treatment that lasted days, the next unfounded accusation that I was spending too much or not contributing enough. And Mrs. Rose, she didn't even enter the equation. For Michael, his mother was just an obstacle. Someone whose existence and needs interfered with his plans, someone who needed to be managed until she could be permanently removed from the game. What kind of person does that? What level of selfishness, of absolute lack of conscience, is necessary to treat your own mother as an inconvenience to be eliminated? There were also bank statements. Apparently Michael wasn't as careful as he thought, or maybe he simply believed no one would ever snoop in that abandoned office. The numbers told an emotional story of systematic embezzlement. Regular transfers from Mrs. Rose's account, which Michael had gained, access to his caregiver, to a joint account of his with Veronica, amounts that should have been used for medications, doctors, house maintenance, were actually financing rent, school tuition, even family vacations Michael took with Veronica and Brian. There was a receipt from a Miami hotel, dated the same weekend he told me he was dealing with a crisis with his mother and therefore couldn't attend my sister's wedding with me. I had gone alone, embarrassed, making up excuses about the dedicated husband who was being a wonderful son. Meanwhile, he was drinking pina coladas on a Florida beach with his mistress and the son I didn't even know existed. The nausea I felt was so intense I had to sit down, breathe deeply several times, fight the urge to simply vomit right there. But what finally broke me, what transformed the anger and shock into something deeper and more painful, was finding at the bottom of the envelope a letter. It was from Veronica, handwritten on paper that smelled of floral perfume, and addressed to Michael. "My love," it began, and each word was a stab. "I know things have been difficult with your family situation, and I admire your patience so much in dealing with all of this. Brian asked me the other day when you'll be able to move in with us for good, and it broke my heart not being able to give a definitive answer. But I understand you need to take care of your mother first. guarantee she's stable before making any drastic change. It's exactly this kindness, this dedication to family, that made me fall in love with you. I just want you to know we're here, waiting, ready for when you can finally be free to live the life you deserve with us. I love you forever. The date of the letter was 6 months before Mrs. Rose's death. 6 months before Michael locked his own mother in that room and let her die slowly. And suddenly everything made horrible and crystalline sense. He wasn't just stealing from his mother, he was actively accelerating her death so he could finally be free and live fully with his secret family. Mrs. Rose wasn't just an ungrateful son and a gold-digger daughter-in-law. In his narrative, she was the only obstacle between Michael and the life he really wanted. And he had decided to remove that obstacle in the cruelest way possible. I couldn't spend another second in that house. The air seemed to be getting heavier with each discovery, as if the walls themselves were pressing against, suffocating me with the weight of so many secrets, so many lies, so much accumulated evil. I gathered everything I had found, Mrs. Rose's diary, the receipts, the photos, the bank statements, Veronica's letter, and put everything in a plastic bag I found in the kitchen. My hands still trembled, not just from anger now, but from something more urgent, more immediate fear. Because if Michael was capable of doing all that to his own elderly mother, what would he do to me if he discovered I had found the proof? He knew I was in Maple Creek. I had said I was going to my mother-in-law's old house to say a goodbye after finally having the courage to. He had given that condescending smile, that look that said, "You'll come crawling back in a few days." But he hadn't tried to stop me. Did he imagine I might discover something? Is that exactly why he let me go? So is Ellie confident he had hidden everything well enough? Or worse, was he, at that exact moment, on his way there to guarantee I never told what I had discovered? I ran out of the house, stumbling over my own feet in the rush, almost falling on the porch stairs that had a rotten step. The night was cold and damp, typical of Kentucky in early fall, and the street was completely deserted and silent. Not a single car passed, not a light on in the few neighboring houses that dotted that rural road. For a moment of pure panic, I thought there would be no one to help me, that I was completely alone in that isolated place with evidence that could destroy the life of a dangerous and conscienceless man. But then I remembered Teresa Miller, the kind neighbor who lived in the house next door, separated only by an empty lot full of tall weeds. Mrs. Rose spoke of her with affection, said Teresa was the only true friend I have around here, that she always brought homemade soups and spent hours chatting on the porch. If anyone could have noticed something strange, if anyone could have suspected Michael, it would be her. I ran through the duet grass, the bag hitting against my leg, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ear. Teresa's house was lit, thank God it was lit, with a warm and welcoming yellow light shining through the living room window. I ran up the 3 steps of the small porch and knocked on the door with an urgency that bordered on desperation. I heard slow steps on the other side, the sound of a chain being removed, and then the door opened, revealing a gray-haired lady with her hair pulled back in a loose bun, wearing a flannel robe and fuzzy slippers. She must have been about 70 years old, with a kind face marked by wrinkles that spoke of many smiles. But at that moment her expression was of immediate concern, seeing the state I was in. "My God, dear, what happened?" she asked, already pulling me inside before I could even answer. "You're shaking all over. Sit here. I'll get some hot tea. You're Sarah, aren't you? Michael's wife. I saw you a few times when you visited Rose. Mrs. Rose's name coming from her mouth was the trigger that made everything collapse. I started crying, not that contained in silent crying I had learned to do so as not to irritate Michael, but loud sobs that shook my whole body. Teresa didn't ask questions. She simply hugged me, letting me cry on the shoulder of her robe that smelled of laundry detergent and lavender, making small comforting sounds as if I were a frightened child. And in a way, that's exactly how I felt. Small, scared, completely lost, in a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be much darker and more dangerous than I ever imagined. When I finally managed to regain some control over my breathing, she guided me to the couch, put a blanket over my shoulders, and disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a steaming cup of tea that she forced into my hands. "Drink slowly," she instructed, sitting beside me with an expression that mixed concern and something that seemed to be expectation, as if she was waiting to hear something, as if she already partially knew what I was about to tell. Now, tell me what happened. You're safe here, dear. No one will hurt you while you're under my roof. Those simple words, that guarantee of safety I hadn't felt in so long, made the tears return. But this time I managed to speak between the sobs. I told everything. I poured out years of repressed pain, of manipulation, of psychological abuse that Michael had made me believe was normal in any relationship. I talked about how he controlled every aspect of my life, how he made me feel crazy when I questioned his inconsistency, how he isolated me from friends and family until I had no one else to turn to. And then I told about what I had found in the house, the locked room, Mrs. Rose's diary, the horrible revelations about how she had been kept prisoner, left to die slowly by her own ungrateful son. I showed Teresa the notebook, watching as she read some passages with tears running down her wrinkled face, her free hand pressed against her mouth as if holding back a scream. I knew, she whispered when she finally could speak. God forgive me. I knew something was terribly wrong, but I didn't do anything, didn't insist enough, ... She turned to me with eyes full of remorse. Rose stopped answering my visits almost a year ago. Michael always said she was resting or not feeling well for company. Once I tried to insist, and he was so cold, so threatening in the way he dismissed me, that I got scared. I should have called someone, should have done more, ... It wasn't your fault, I managed to say, though the words came out choked. He is ... Michael is very good at manipulating, at making people believe. Even I, who lived with him, didn't realize how much of a monster he was until now. I took a deep breath and then told about the second discovery, about Veronica, about Brian, about the complete double life Michael maintained in Louisville. Teresa was visibly shocked, her mouth opening in an expression of growing horror. A second family, she repeated, incredulous, and he was using Rose's money to support them while keeping her locked up like an animal. Sarah, dear, this isn't just cruelty. This is criminal. You need to go to the police. You need to ... But I interrupted her, shaking my head violently. Will the local police take this seriously? Michael is charming, convincing, has a good job and reputation. I'm just the emotionally unstable wife. That's how he always described me to everyone. And Mrs. Rose already died months ago. How do we prove it was homicide and not just negligence? How do we make this result in something more than an investigation that will die in a few months? It was Teresa who had the idea that would change everything. Daniel Ramirez, she said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with a spark of hope. Rose's lawyer. He was her lawyer for more than 30 years, took care of all her legal affairs. They were close more than client and lawyer. They were true friends. Daniel was devastated when he heard about her death, and at the time he told me there was something unresolved that bothered him, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. If anyone will take this seriously, if anyone has the resources and motivation to make Michael pay, it's him. She was already getting up, looking for the phone. He lives in Chicago now, partially retired, but still maintains some special clients. I have his number here somewhere. While she rummaged through a drawer full of papers and business cards, I felt for the first time since I had entered that cursed house a glimmer of something that could be hope. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. Maybe there were people willing to fight for justice for Mrs. Rose. And maybe, just maybe, I could finally make Michael pay for every moment of suffering he caused. Teresa found the cards, slightly yellowed but still legible, and dialed the number with trembling fingers. It was almost 10 at night, late to call someone, but she insisted Daniel had said to look for him at any time if there was any emergency related to Rose. The phone rang 3 times before a male voice answered, sleepy but immediately alert when Teresa identified herself. Daniel, it's Teresa Miller, Rose Turner's neighbor. I need you to hear something very important, ... double quotes. She paused, looked at me as if asking permission, and when I nodded, she continued. Rose's daughter-in-law Sara is here with me. She found some things in the house, things that... Daniel, I think Rose was murdered, and we have proof. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a second before we heard, even at a distance, his voice changing completely in tone, becoming hard, focused, professional. Put her on the phone. Now, Teresa handed me the phone, and with still trembling hands, I brought it to my ear. Daniel Ramirez's voice was deep, loaded with an authority that came from decades practicing law. Sarah, I'm Daniel Ramirez. I was Rose's lawyer and friend for many years. I need you to tell me, with as much detail as possible, exactly what you found. And then I poured out everything again, this time trying to be more organized, more factual, describing the locked room, the specific content of the diary, the dates and amounts in the financial receipt, the existence of Brian and Veronica. I heard him taking notes on the other side, occasionally asking specific questions that showed he was building a case in his head, even as we talked. When I finally finished, exhausted from reliving everything one more time, he was silent for a long moment. Rose tried to change the will, he finally said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. About a year and a half ago, she came to me saying she wanted to leave the house to you, Sarah. Said you were the only person who really cared about her, who treated her like a human being and not as a source of inheritance. We scheduled a meeting to formalize everything, but she never showed up. I tried to call, visit, and Michael always had an excuse. She was sick, she was confused. It wasn't a good time. Eventually he told me Rose had changed her mind, that she wanted to keep everything as it was. I should have insisted more, should have demanded to speak with her personally. The guilt in his voice mirrored what Teresa had shown, all of us carrying the weight of not having done more to save a woman who was clearly asking for help in every way she could. This doesn't end like this, Daniel continued, and now his voice had a steel edge that admitted no argument. Sarah, I need you to do exactly what I'm going to say. First, do not, and I emphasize, do not contact Michael under any circumstances. Don't say where you are. Don't answer his calls. Don't give any indication you found this information. Second, stay in Maple Creek until I get there. I'm going to catch the first available flight tomorrow morning. Third, keep all the evidence in a safe place. I suggest you take photos of everything and send them to me by email right now. So we have backups in case something happens to the originals. And fourth, he paused, and when he spoke again, there was fierce determination in his words. Prepare yourself, because we're going to make that man pay for every second of suffering he caused Rose. We're going to expose every lie, every act of cruelty, every cent stolen. And when we're done, Michael Turner will understand there are consequences for his action. Consequences no manipulation or charm can avoid. Rose deserves justice. And by God, she's going to have it. I hung up the phone, feeling a strange mixture of terror and hope. The plan was in motion. There was no going back. And somehow, I knew Mrs. Rose was watching. Maybe finally at peace, knowing her death wouldn't be in vain. That the final words in her diary, "Bring justice," were about to become reality in a way Michael never could have predicted or prevented. I spent the night at Teresa's house, in a cozy guest room that smelled of mothballs and lavender sachets, but sleep didn't come as every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Rose's face, not as it was in the smiling photos decorating her house, but as it must have been in her final days, pale, scared, alone in that horrible room. And then I saw Michael, that condescending smile he used when he wanted to make me feel small. Those empty eyes I now understood were incapable of real empathy. How many nights had I slept beside him, completely oblivious to the monstrosity sharing my... How many times had he returned from that house after denying medication to his own elderly mother and simply lain down next to me as if it were a normal... The thought made me feel contaminated, as if I had spent years being an involuntary accomplice to crimes I didn't even imagine existed. But not anymore. Now I knew. And knowledge, however painful, was power. It was the weapon Mrs. Rose had left me, carefully documented in pages stained with tears and written with trembling hands. And I wouldn't waste this gift. Early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen, I did exactly what Daniel had instructed. I photographed each page of Mrs. Rose's diary, each receipt, each bank statement, each compromising photo of Michael's secret life. My hands were surprisingly steady now, no longer trembling from fear or shock, but moving with decided purpose. I organized everything in digital folders, added explanatory notes where necessary, and sent everything to the email Daniel had given me. There were so many pieces of evidence, it took almost 20 minutes for all the files to be uploaded and sent. that progress bar moving with agonizing slowness while I held my breath, as if afraid something could go wrong at the last second. When I finally saw the confirmation message, email sent successfully, I felt an immense weight partially lifted from my shoulders. Even if something happened to me, even if Michael somehow found out and tried to stop me, the proof was safe. It was with someone who knew what to do with it. Mrs. Rose's emotional story wouldn't die in silence. Teresa prepared a hearty breakfast: scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, pancakes with maple syrup, but I could barely eat. My stomach was closed, wrapped in a mixture of anxiety and anticipation of what was to come. She didn't insist, just left the food on the table and sat beside me, holding my hand with that maternal affection I hadn't received in so long. "Rose would be proud of you," she said softly, her faded blue eyes fixed on mine with surprising intensity for someone her age. "She always said you had an inner strength Michael tried to extinguish, but could never completely. Said that one day you'd see the truth and, when you did, you'd be unstoppable." The words made me choke with emotion. Mrs. Rose had believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Had seen something I thought I'd lost years ago under the constant weight of manipulation and control. And now, finally, I was proving she was right. I wasn't the weak and incapable woman Michael had convinced me I was. I was someone capable of facing horrible truths and fighting for justice, even when everything inside me screamed to simply run away and forget everything. Around 9 in the morning, my cell phone rang. It was Daniel. "I'm arriving in Louisville in an hour," he informed, his voice still carrying that iron determination from the night before. "From there, I'll rent a car and head straight to Maple Creek. I should be there around noon. Meanwhile, I got some important things done." I heard the sound of papers being handled on the other end. I contacted 2 agents from Jefferson County, acquaintances of mine from previous cases, people I trust absolutely. They're willing to accompany us when we go confront Michael, to guarantee everything is done legally and that you're safe. I also spoke with the medical examiner who signed Rose's death certificate. He agreed to review the case in light of this new information. If we can prove there was intentional negligence resulting in death, we're talking about homicide. Sarah? Not just fraud or financial abuse. Homicide. The word hung in the air between us, heavy as lead. Michael wasn't just an abusive husband, an ungrateful son, a cheater. He was a murderer. He had killed his own mother as surely as if he had used a weapon. The hours until Daniel's arrival dragged by as if time itself had decided to move in slow motion. Teresa tried to distract me with conversations, telling stories about Mrs. Rose from when they were younger, about how she was vibrant and full of life before the isolation imposed by Michael began. She loved gardening, Teresa recounted, pointing through the window at what was once Mrs. Rose's impeccable garden. She spent hours there, caring for each flower as if it were a treasure. She said plants were honest. You cared for them, they flourished. You neglected them, they died. There were no mind games, no manipulation. I think that's why she took refuge there so much. It was the only place where everything made sense. I looked at that garden now overtaken by weeds, at the flowers Mrs. Rose loved so much, suffocated and dead, and I saw in it a perfect metaphor for what Michael had done. He didn't just kill his mother physically, but systematically destroyed everything she loved, everything that kept her connected to life and joy. It was cruelty in its purest and most deliberate form. Finally, just after noon, I saw a black sedan stop in front of Teresa's house. A man of perhaps his early 60s got out, tall and thin, with carefully combed gray hair and metal-framed glasses. He wore a suit that, despite having seen better days, still carried an air of professional authority. 2 other men got out of an unmarked car that stopped right behind, both wearing casual clothes but with that unmistakable posture of law enforcement. Daniel climbed the porch steps with decided strides, and when Teresa opened the door, his eyes immediately searched for mine. "Sarah," he said, extending his hand firmly but gently, "I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances. Rose talked about you a lot, always with affection, always with hope that you'd find a way to escape that toxic marriage." He gestured to the 2 men behind him. "These are Agents Morrison and Chun from the county department. They're going to accompany us to guarantee everything is done according to the law." The agents nodded politely, but their faces remained serious, professional. This wasn't a social visit. It was the beginning of an operation. Daniel sat at Teresa's kitchen table and opened a worn leather folder. taking out printed copies of all the photos I had sent during the early morning hours. Seeing all of that organized so systematically, with markings and annotations in the margins made by Daniel's precise handwriting, transformed that chaotic collection of horrors into something that seemed tangible, prosecutable, undeniable. "This is much more than I expected," he admitted, flipping through the pages with an increasingly somber expression. The diary alone would already be powerful evidence, but combined with the financial records, the photos of the secret family, the medical receipts, Sarah, this is an airtight case. Michael won't be able to dodge this with charm or manipulation. He looked at me directly, and there was something like respect, maybe even admiration, in his eyes. "Rose chose well in trusting you. What you did wasn't easy. Entering that house, facing these truths. Many people would have simply run away, pretended they didn't see anything, left it for someone else to deal with. But you didn't. You honored her memory in the most courageous way possible." The words warmed me inside, filling empty spaces that years of Michael's criticism had excavated. "So what's the plan?" I asked, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. Daniel smiled a small but genuine smile that said he saw in me something beyond the frightened victim. "First, we need to locate Michael. Do you have any idea where he might be?" I thought for a moment, if he's not at our apartment in Lexington, then ... double quotes, and then it hit me, obvious in retro. "He's in Louisville with Veronica and Brian. That's where he always is when he doesn't need to keep up appearances." Daniel nodded as if he already expected that answer. "The agents already checked the address that appears in the documents, Crescent Hill, right?" Agent Morrison confirmed. "Frankfurt Street, number 2847. A two-bedroom apartment in a well-maintained building. Rent value suggests it's a decent, comfortable place. Definitely not where you'd expect to find a secret apartment." Daniel closed the folder with a definitive sound. "So, that's where we're going. And Sarah, ... double quotes." He paused, making sure I was listening with full attention. "When we get there, when Michael sees you with this evidence, he's going to try to do what he always did, manipulate, lie, turn the situation around to make you look unstable or vindictive. You need to be prepared for that. You need to stay firm, no matter what he says, no matter how he tries to twist reality." "Can you do that?" I looked at that man who had flown across the country to help, at those agents who were willing to bring justice, at Teresa who held my hand with encouraging strength, and then I thought about Mrs. Rose, alone in that horrible room, writing her last words with trembling hands, trusting that I would bring justice. "I can," I answered with a certainty I felt to my bones. "I'm ready to end this once and for all." We prepared to leave, a strange caravan of justice, Daniel's sedan in front, the agent's unmarked car right behind, and me, in the passenger seat next to Daniel, holding against my chest a bag with the originals of all the evidence. Teresa watched us leave from the porch, one hand over her heart, tears running freely down her wrinkled face. "Make him pay, dear," she shouted as we pulled away. "For Rose, for you, for all Hevis." I waved through the window, not trusting my voice not to break if I tried to speak. The road from Maple Creek to Louisville seemed to stretch infinitely before us, each kilometer taking me closer to the confrontation that would change everything. Daniel drove in concentrated silence, occasionally checking the rearview mirror to guarantee the agents were still following us. I looked out the window without really seeing the landscape passing by harvested cornfields, old barns leaning against the wind, small towns that appeared and disappeared in a blur. My mind was totally focused on what was to come, mentally reviewing each piece of evidence, preparing myself for the moment when I would look Michael in the eyes and finally see the recognition that his lies, his control, his total humiliation of everyone around him, all of it was coming to an end. Mrs. Rose would have her justice, and I would finally have my freedom. The emotional story that began with a diary hidden under a filthy mattress was about to have its climax, and this Jimmy, the villain, wouldn't get away with it. Entering Louisville was like crossing a portal to another dimension of Michael's life, a dimension I should never have seen, where he was a completely different person from the man I knew. Crescent Hill was a charming neighborhood, full of old trees whose leaves were already beginning to display shades of red and gold from autumn. Well-kept Victorian houses with wide porches and impeccable gardens. It was the type of place where families raised their children, where neighbors greeted each other by name, where life seemed to follow that calm and predictable rhythm that appears in margarine commercials. And somewhere in those pretty and safe streets, Michael Turner maintained his true life, the family he chose, the existence he prioritized while transforming my world into a silent hell and letting his own elderly mother die from abandonment. The irony was so bitter I could taste it in my mouth. The ungrateful son who preached family values while systematically destroying any real semblance of family around him. The anger I had been repressing since the night before started boiling, hot and intense, burning through the fear I also carried in my chest. Daniel slowed down when we entered Frankfurt Street, his eyes checking the house numbers until he found what we were looking for. There, he indicated, pointing to a 3-story apartment building with a red brick facade and windows with flower boxers full of petunias still blooming. The agent's car stopped right behind ours, and through the rearview mirror, I saw Morrison and Chun talking briefly, probably finalizing the approach plan. My heart was racing now, beating so hard I felt it pulse even in my fingertips. In a matter of minutes, maybe seconds, I would be face to face with Michael, no longer the submissive and insecure Sarah he had molded through years of psychological manipulation, but the Sarah who knew all his lies, all his crimes, all the lives he destroyed in the name of his own convenience and greed. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked softly, his hand hovering over the door handle. I took a deep breath, thinking about Mrs. Rose writing those last trembling words, "Bring justice," and nodded. "I'm ready." Let's end this. We got out of the cars in an almost ceremonial silence, as if we all understood the gravity of the moment. Agents, Morrison, and Chun positioned themselves strategically, one slightly ahead, the other covering the rear, while Daniel and I walked toward the building entrance. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the neighborhood was alive with normal domestic sounds, children playing in some nearby yard, the hum of a lawnmower, soft music leaking from open windows. Everything so perfectly normal, so frighteningly ordinary, that for a moment I wondered if we hadn't made some terrible mistake, if all of this wasn't some grotesque misunderstanding. But then I looked at the bag I was carrying, at the physical weight of the evidence inside, and knew with absolute certainty it was no mistake at all. The only thing wrong was that Michael had managed to maintain this farce for so long, live in this suburban paradise while leaving a trail of destruction and suffering wherever he went. But today, this ended. Today, Michael Turner's two lives would collide catastrophically and irreversibly. Apartment 2847 was on the second floor, and as we climbed the stairs, each step seeming to amplify the sound of our footsteps, definitely I could hear voices inside. A masculine laugh I recognized immediately, the performative guffaw Michael used when he wanted to seem relaxed and pleasant. A feminine voice responding, soft and caring, and then a higher voice, young, saying something about after the baseball game tomorrow. Brian, the secret son. The child who grew up believing he had a present and loving father, with no idea of the darkness that man carried inside him. Part of me, a small and foolish part that still held some remnant of misdirected compassion, felt sorry for what was about to happen to that boy. But then I remembered Mrs. Rose dying alone and scared so that boy could have a comfortable life, and the compassion evaporated like water on a hot griddle. Some truths need to be revealed, no matter how painful they are. Some people need to pay for their choices, no matter how many innocent lives are affected in the process. Daniel knocked on the door, not a hesitant or polite knock, but firm and authoritative. The kind of knock that makes it clear whoever is on the other side won't simply go away if ignored. The voices inside stopped abruptly. I heard footsteps approaching, and then the door opened, revealing a blonde woman of maybe her early 30s, pretty in an ordinary way, wearing jeans and a casual blouse, an apron tied around her waist as if she'd been interrupted in the middle of preparing some meal. Her cordial smile, that automatic expression people use when they answer strangers at the door, froze when her eyes landed on me. She recognized me. I don't know how. Maybe she'd seen photos. Maybe Michael had committed the slip of showing me at some point. But the way her face paled, how her hand gripped the doorknob hard enough for her knuckles to turn white, made it clear she knew exactly who I was. You, double quotes, she began, her voice coming out hoarse, but couldn't complete the sentence. Veronica Hale? Foda? Agent Morrison asked, showing his identification. I'm Agent Morrison from the Jefferson County Department. We need to speak with Michael Turner. Is he home? The mention of law enforcement agents made Veronica stumble backward as if she'd taken a physical blow. What's happening? Michael, she called, turning toward the interior of the apartment, her voice rising an octave in panic. Michael, there are people here, there's police, and then he appeared, coming out of what seemed to be the living room, a beer can in his hand, wearing a light blue polo shirt and shorts, the perfect image of the suburban dad relaxing on the weekend. But when his eyes met mine, when he saw not just me but Daniel and the agents behind us, all the color drained from his face in an instant. I saw pass through his features a quick sequence of emotions, surprise, confusion, and then that cold calculation I knew so well. His brain working at top speed, trying to find an exit, an explanation, a way to manipulate the situation in his favor. Sarah, he said, and had the audacity to sound confused, even a bit concerned. What are you doing here? Who are these people? Are you okay? Are you okay? That performance, that ability to feign innocence and concern even when caught in the lie, would have worked on me a week ago, would have made me question my own sanity, wonder if I wasn't seeing things that didn't exist, interpreting situations the wrong way, but not anymore. Not after everything I had discovered, not after reading Mrs. Rose's agonizing words, not after seeing with my own eyes the incontestable proof of every lie. Stop, Michael. My voice came out surprisingly firm, carrying an authority I didn't know I possessed. Just stop. It's over. The lies, the manipulation, the whole farce. It's over. I turned to Veronica, who was looking between me and Michael with an expression of growing confusion. You think you know this man? Think you know who he really is? I opened the bag and started taking out the evidence. First Mrs. Rose's diary, then the receipts, the bank statement. Let me tell you an emotional story about the man you share your life with, about what he did to his own elderly mother to be able to afford this perfect existence here with you. Michael tried to interrupt me, taking a step forward with that condescending smile he used when he wanted to make me look hysterical. Sarah, you're clearly going through something, but this isn't the place or time to. But Daniel cut him off, his experienced lawyer's voice echoing through the hallway with irrefutable authority. Mr. Turner, I strongly suggest you remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. I'm Daniel Ramirez, Rose Turner's lawyer, your late mother. In case you forgot about her while building this secret life. He gestured to the agents. And these are Agents Morrison and June, who are here to guarantee you're taken into appropriate custody after we hear the charges against you. The word custody made Michael finally lose some of that calculated composure. Custody, charges, what the hell are you talking about? But his tone was too loud, too defensive, and I saw the exact moment Veronica began to understand something was deeply wrong. She looked at him with wide eyes, a hand rising to cover her mouth, and then looked at me again, really seeing me for the first time. Who are you? She whispered. I'm Sarah Turner, I replied, each word falling like a stone in a calm lake. Michael's wife, his legal wife, married to him for 7 years. I saw absolute shock cross Veronica's face, saw her legs weaken, forcing her to lean against the wall. Wife? She repeated, her voice coming out like a moan. No, no, this can't be right. Michael, you said you were divorced, that your ex-wife had double quotes, but Michael was no longer looking at her. He was staring at me with an intensity that bordered on violence, those eyes I knew so well now uncovered, without the mask, revealing all the fury and contempt he always felt but kept carefully hidden. You had no right, he hissed, the words coming out between clenched teeth. You had no right to come here, to stick your nose where you weren't called, to destroy, double quotes. Destroy what? I exploded, all the anger, all the pain, all the accumulated hatred finally finding voice. Your double life, your perfectly constructed lies. Or is it that you're worried I destroyed your chance to get away with it after murdering your own mother? The word murder fell in the silence like a bomb. Veronica let out a suffocated sound, something between a scream and a sob. Behind Michael, a small figure appeared in the living room doorway. Brian, a boy of maybe 11 years old with the same dark eyes as his father, looking at the scene with innocent confusion. "Dad, what's happening? Who are these people?" The child's presence seemed to break something in Veronica. "Brian, go to your room," she ordered, her voice trembling but firm. "Now?" The boy hesitated, looking at his father as if seeking permission. But Veronica repeated louder, "Now, Brian." He finally obeyed, disappearing down the hallway, and I heard a door close softly. And then Veronica turned to Michael with a fury that mirrored mine. "You're married?" she practically screamed. "All these years, all the times you said you loved me, that we were a family, you had a wife, and what was that part about your mother, ... about murder? Michael, what the hell is happening here?" She was crying now, tears of rage and betrayal running freely down her face. And, for the first time since I'd known him, I saw Michael Turner completely cornered, surrounded by his crumbling lies, with nowhere to run or hide. Daniel stepped forward, holding Mrs. Rose's diary as if it were a sacred Bible. "Miss Halley," he said with gentleness that contrasted completely with the hardness in his eyes when looking at Michael, "I understand this is shocking and painful, but we need you to hear the truth. Michael kept his mother, Rose Turner, in captivity in the last months of her life. He locked her in a room without ventilation, denied her essential medications for serious heart conditions, let her die slowly while trying to force her to sign documents that would give him total control over her finances. And during all this time, he was diverting money that should have been used for her medical care to maintain this residence. Pay your expenses. Maintain 2 families while an elderly woman withered in suffering." He opened the diary and began to read, his voice echoing through the hallway. "Michael keeps me locked up. I don't have enough food. My medications ran out days ago. I'm dying, and my own son is letting me die." Mrs. Rose's words, read aloud in that perfect domestic setting, were like acid corroding the facade of normalcy. Veronica was sobbing openly now, and even Michael, who I had never seen demonstrate genuine remorse in his life, finally seemed to understand there was no way out, no manipulation or charm that could save him this time. A.G. Morrison stepped forward, taking handcuffs from his belt. "Micaiah Tudner, you're under arrest on suspicion of homicide, elder abuse, financial fraud, and forgery. You have the right to remain silent, ... double quotes, but I didn't hear the rest. Because Michael, finally breaking completely, lunged in my direction with a roar of animal rage, his hands extended as if he wanted to strangle me right there. Asian Chun intercepted him immediately, twisting his arm behind his back while Morrison completed the handcuffing process. Michael screaming, obscenities, threats, finally revealing the true beast that always lived under the skin of the charming man. But his words didn't affect me, they were just noise. The last gasp of a monster finally being contained. When they dragged him out of the building, still fighting against the handcuffs, still screaming that I would pay for this, that I destroyed everything, I felt only a strange emptiness, not triumph, not satisfaction, just a deep tiredness and the feeling that an immense weight was finally being removed from my shoulders. Veronica was on her knees on the apartment floor now, sobbing, and for a moment our eyes met. 2 women deceived by the same man, both victims of his infinite capacity to lie and manipulate. "I'm sorry," I said, and it was true. I didn't feel sorry for her for having lost Michael. Neither of us had lost anything of value, but for her son, for the total humiliation of discovering everything you believed about your life was a lie. She didn't respond, just kept crying, and Daniel gently guided me back outside, back to the car, back to the reality that Michael Turner was finally going to pay for his crimes. Mrs. Rose could rest in peace, and I could finally start living for real. The days following Michael's arrest were a whirlwind of activities that left me dizzy. Daniel had installed me in a modest hotel in Louisville, far enough from the apartment in Crescent Hills so I wouldn't have to relive that confrontation every time I looked out the window, but close enough to be available for the interrogations and statements that multiplied exponentially. Veronica Hale, after spending the entire night in absolute shock, made a decision even. I didn't expect she decided to collaborate completely with the investigation. The morning after the arrest, she showed up at the county police station with her own collection of evidence, a determined expression replacing the despair that had dominated her face the day before. "He deceived me too," she said, when we met briefly in the waiting room, her eyes red and swollen from so much crying, but her voice firm. "My son deserves to know the truth about his father. And that woman, your mother-in-law, deserves justice. If I can help in any way, I'll help." And she did. Veronica brought years of financial records Michael had left in the apartment, thinking he was safe there. That was his protected territory, where he could let his guard down. There were emails between him and questionable accountants, discussing ways to access maternal funds without unnecessary authorization, an elaborate way of saying theft. There were text messages where Michael complained about Mrs. Rose with casual cruelty that made my stomach turn. "The old woman is being stubborn again. I need to find another way to make her cooperate. The faster this ends, the better for everyone." Veronica also revealed conversations they had where Michael painted his mother as senile, problematic, almost a threat to her own safety. He said she was becoming violent, that she needed to be isolated for her own good. Veronica told the investigators, tears streaming again as she understood, in retrospect, all the lies. "I believe. God forgive me. I believed and never questioned, never asked to meet her, never insisted on visiting her. I was an accomplice through ignorance, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life." The genuine pain in her words was palpable, and I realized Michael didn't just have two victims. He had destroyed multiple lives with his elaborate web of lies. No gold digger, daughter-in-law, or ungrateful son could cause as much damage as that man had caused, pretending to be exactly the opposite of what he was. The emotional story leaked to the media with a speed that caught me completely off guard. I don't know if it was some police station employee talking more than they should, or if it was simply the type of case that local journalists sniffed out like sharks sensing blood in the water, but within 48 hours, Michael Turner's arrest was on every Louisville news. Local men accused of keeping elderly mother in captivity while maintaining secret family, announced the Louisville Courier-Journal in a front-page headline. The photo they chose to use was of Michael being escorted in handcuffs. That face, that was always so carefully composed, now contorted in impotent fury. And something about that image, seeing the man who terrorized me for years reduced to a common criminal being taken to jail, gave me the first real glimpse that maybe, just maybe, all of this would really end for real. Local TV stations picked up the story quickly, transforming it into the type of narrative that captured attention because it had everything: betrayal, crime, abuse, a double life perfectly hidden until it crumbled spectacularly. Reporters camped in front of the Crescent Hill building, interviewing shocked neighbors who described Michael as quiet, polite, the last person you'd expect to be involved in something like this. Daniel had to hire a press secretary to handle all the interview requests. They wanted to talk to me, too. Veronica even tried to interview poor Brian, which Veronica fiercely blocked, protecting her son from the total humiliation of having the family tragedy exposed publicly. I gave only one interview to a local reporter named Jennifer Hayes, who seemed genuinely interested in telling Mrs. Rose's story, not just the scandal, but who she was, what she suffered, why it mattered. She was a kind woman, I told the camera, struggling to keep my voice steady, who loved gardening, who made delicious pies, who treated everyone with kindness, and she died alone and scared because her own son saw her as an obstacle and not as a human. I want people to remember her not just as a victim, but as a person who deserved much better than she received. The interview aired that night, and my phone, which I had changed the number specifically to prevent Michael from finding me, exploded with messages of support from complete strangers. People sharing their own stories of abuse, of manipulation, of toxic relationships from which they finally managed to escape. And each message, each word of encouragement, made me feel a little less alone in that terrifying journey of rebuilding a life Michael had systematically destroyed. The police investigation expanded rapidly beyond what even Daniel had anticipated. Forensic investigators visited the house in Maple Creek, documenting every inch of that horrible room where Mrs. Rose spent her final day. They took photos of the scratch marks on the wall, which later analyzers confirmed were consistent with human nails, proving her desperate attempts to escape. They found Mrs. Rose's DNA all over the room, concentrated especially near the door, physical evidence of how many hours she must have spent there begging to be freed. The medical examiner who originally had signed the death certificate listing natural heart failure as cause was horrified to review the case with the new information. If I had known the circumstances, if someone had mentioned she was being kept isolated without access to prescribed medications, he told investigators, clearly shaken. The cause of death should have been listed as homicide by intentional negligence. She didn't die of natural causes. She died because someone deliberately deprived her of care necessary for survival. That official reclassification transformed Michael's case from elder abuse and fraud to second-degree homicide. The evidence kept accumulating in ways that made even the most experienced investigators shake their heads in disbelief. They discovered Michael had forged Mrs. Rose's signature on multiple documents over the last 2 years, not just the will he tried to change, but also checks, bank authorization, even a power of attorney that gave him legal control over her medical decisions. A handwriting expert testified the signatures were crude imitations, easily identifiable as fraud to anyone who actually compared them with authentic examples of Mrs. Turner's handwriting. Michael hadn't even been careful. Pure arrogance, assuming no one would ever check that he was too smart to be caught. Bank records showed a pattern of transfers that started small, $50 here, $100 there, but escalated rapidly in the final months of Mrs. Rose's life. In the month she died, Michael had transferred more than $15,000 from her account, money that went directly to pay the rent in Crescent Hill, Bryant's tuition at an expensive private school, even a new car he bought and registered in Veronica's name as a surprise gift. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a woman named Diana Kozłowski, with a reputation for being relentless in elder abuse cases, built a prosecution so airtight that even the defense lawyers Michael managed to hire using money God knows where from, since all his accounts were frozen, privately admitted, was almost impossible to fight. We rarely see a case with so much documentation, Kozłowski told me in one of our preparatory meetings. Mrs. Rose's diary alone would be powerful, but combined with all the other physical, financial, testimonial evidence, Sarah, this man is going to pay for what he did. I can guarantee that. And for the first time in a long time, I believed justice wasn't just a pretty word people said to comfort victims. It was something real, tangible, that was happening in real time. Michael's carefully constructed image as family man was completely demolished. Investigative reports began discovering other inconsistencies in his life, small frauds at work, past relationships that mysteriously ended with the women moving to another city by their own choice, a pattern of manipulative behavior that had extended for decades but had never been connected until now because Michael was so good at compartmentalizing, at keeping each aspect of his life carefully separated from the others. Neighbors in Lexington, where Michael and I had lived as a couple, also began speaking out, sharing stories that at the time seemed just peculiarities but that now, in the light of truth, revealed a sinister pattern. I always thought it was strange how he talked about his wife, a neighbor told reporters, always making little deprecating jokes, comments about how she was forgetful or emotional. But he said it with a smile, so you laughed along, thinking it was just couple banter. Now I was witnessing psychological abuse happening right in front of my eyes. Another neighbor remembered once hearing screams coming from our apartment, my voice begging, Michael's voice thundering in response. But when he encountered Michael the next day and asked if everything was okay, Michael just laughed and said I was having a dramatic day again. You know how women are. The neighbor had believed him, had laughed along, and now carried the guilt of not having done more. We all had believed Michael because he was exactly the type of person you believe charming, articulate, always with the perfect explanation for any inconsistency. That was his true skill, and he had used it to destroy lives with terrifying efficiency. The media also found Teresa Miller, and the good lady didn't spare words when describing her suspicions about Michael. Rose called me a few times in the first months, saying she was worried that Michael was acting strange. Teresa told the cameras, sitting on her cozy porch that was now surrounded by reporters. She said he was pressuring her about money, about the house, asking strange questions about her will. And then, suddenly, she stopped answering my calls. Michael says she didn't want visits anymore, that she was tired, that she needed privacy. I should have insisted more. Should have called the authorities, but he was so convincing, so ... normal. How do you accuse someone who seems so respectable of doing something so horrible? Her words echoed the guilt so many of us felt, the guilt of having seen signs but not having recognized what they really meant until it was too late. But Daniel reminded me, repeatedly, that the only person truly guilty was Michael. He was a predator, Daniel said with absolute conviction. Predators are experts at seeming harmless. That's how they get multiple victims. You're not responsible for not having seen through the mask. No one is, except him for having used that mask to do harm. Those words helped me, at least a little, deal with the total humiliation of understanding how long I had spent being a victim, without even realizing the full extent of what was happening. As the story spread, other victims began to emerge. Not direct victims of crimes, but people who had been manipulated or hurt by Michael over the years. A college ex-girlfriend who told about how he had isolated her from friends, controlled her clothes and appearance, and then cruelly discarded her when she finally tried to establish boundaries. A former coworker who described how Michael had stolen credit for an important project and then systematically destroyed the colleague's reputation when he tried to report it. A pattern of behavior that extended for decades, always calculated, always leaving victims in its wake, but never being caught because he was careful to never go too far until his greed and his need to control everything finally led him to cross a line from which there was no return. And now, finally, all these victims had a voice, a space to tell their stories, to be believed. The public narrative changed completely. Michael was no longer the charming man unjustly accused. He was the monster he always was, finally exposed to the light of day. And that exposure, that public validation that everything I suffered wasn't imagination or exaggerated sensitivity, was the first real step toward my own healing. Mrs. Rose had asked for justice, and justice was coming fast and relentless, like a storm no one, especially Michael Turner, could stop. The trial began on a gray November day, almost 6 months after that afternoon when I found Mrs. Rose's diary hidden under a filthy mat. The Jefferson County Courthouse was packed, reporters occupying every available seat in the press gallery. Curious people lining up since dawn to get a place. Television cameras camped on the building steps like sentinels awaiting the story of the year. I was sitting in the first row, next to Daniel, who had become not just my lawyer but something close to a friend, a paternal protector who guided me through each stage of this terrifying process. Veronica was a few rows back, accompanied by a social worker who was helping her deal with the emotional repercussions of all this. Our eyes met briefly when I entered a silent acknowledgement of two women who had been deceived by the same monster, united now not by choice but by the shared need to see justice done. She waved slightly, a small but significant gesture that said, "We're in this together," and I reciprocated before sitting down, mentally preparing myself for what was to come. Michael was brought in through the side door, escorted by 2 guards, wearing a gray suit that was probably the same outfit he wore when he wanted to impress clients or appear at social events as the perfect husband. But now, after months in jail awaiting trial, he looked different, thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes. His hair not as carefully combed as it used to be. And yet, when his eyes swept across the courtroom and landed on me, I saw that same attempt at control, that look that said, "You're going to regret this," that barely contained rage he always used to keep me in line. But this Chimmy, for the first time in all the years I'd known him, that look didn't affect me. I didn't feel the familiar tightness in my chest, didn't feel the need to look away, to make myself smaller, to disappear. I looked directly back, maintained eye contact until he was the one who looked away first, and in that moment I felt a fundamental shift inside me. Michael Turner no longer had power over me. He was just a pathetic and cruel man who was finally going to answer for his crimes. The total humiliation was no longer mine. It was his, completely his, while the whole world watched his fall. Judge Margaret Thornton entered, a woman of perhaps her early 50s, with hair pulled back in a severe bun, in an expression that didn't allow nonsense from anyone. She had a reputation for being fair but relentless, especially in cases involving elder abuse. She had lost her own mother to neglect in a nursing home years ago, and since then had a particular sensitivity to this type of crime. "We're here for the case of the state vs. Michael James Turner," she announced, her voice echoing through the room with absolute authority. "The defendant is accused of second-degree homicide, elder abuse resulting in death, document forgery, large-scale financial fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. How does the defendant plead? Michael's defense attorney, a corpulent man named Richard Brennan, who had a reputation for getting acquittals for obviously guilty clients, through legal technicalities, stood up with that performative confidence expensive lawyers use as armor. Not guilty on all charges, Your Honor. The word not guilty, coming from his mouth, applied to Michael, almost made me laugh, a bitter, hysterical laugh that I had to stifle by biting the inside of my cheek. Not guilty. As if the evidence wasn't overwhelming, as if Mrs. Rose's diary was some elaborate fiction, as if that horror room didn't exist. Prosecutor Diana Kozłowski stood up to make her opening statement, and from the first words, it was clear she wasn't going to spare anyone. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, looking each juror directly in the eyes, you're going to hear an emotional story in the coming days. But it's not the kind of story you tell children before bed. It's the kind of story that will make you question how far a human being can fall in cruelty, greed, and total lack of empathy. She walked to a table where all the evidence was organized. Mrs. Rose's diary in a transparent plastic cover, enlarged photos of the prison room, stacks of financial documents marked with colorful post-it notes. Rose Turner was a 72-year-old woman, a widow who lived a modest but comfortable life in Maple, Kentucky. She had a paid-off house, decent savings accumulated during years of hard work, and a single son, the defendant, Michael Turner. She loved that son, raised him alone after her husband died when Michael was only 10 years old. She sacrificed everything for him, as mothers do. And how did he repay that love, that sacrifice? Diana paused dramatically, letting the question hang in the heavy air of the courtroom. He locked her in a room without ventilation, denied her essential medications for heart conditions that could have killed her, and eventually did. Systematically stole her money to finance a secret life with a mistress and an illegitimate son, and let her die slowly, alone, scared, while pretending to the world to be the dedicated son. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not just negligence. That's premeditated murder, calculated, executed with coldness over months. Michael's defense tried to paint a completely different narrative in their opening statement. Brennan stood up with that confident smile of someone who thinks they can fool anyone, and began, my client, Michael Turner, is a hard-working man, a dedicated father, someone who tried to care for a difficult and increasingly unstable mother. Yes, he made mistakes. Yes, perhaps he could have done some things differently. But homicide, premeditated murder. He shook his head with an expression of exaggerated incredulity. You're going to discover that Rose Turner was suffering from advanced dementia in the final years of her life. She was paranoid, accusing people of absurd things, creating narratives that had no basis in reality. The diary the prosecution values so much. It was written by a woman who wasn't in full control of her mental faculties. As for Michael's relationship with Veronica Haley, that's not a crime. Marital problems don't make someone a murderer. And yes, Michael made some errors in judgment regarding his mother's finance, but that was done with the intention of guaranteeing she had the best possible care. Nothing my client did was done with malicious or homicidal intent. I heard that performance with a mixture of shock and growing anger. How did he dare suggest Mrs. Rose was lying, that her words weren't trustworthy? How dare he transform the ungrateful son into a victim of circumstances? But then the parade of witnesses began, and each testimony was more devastating than the last. Teresa Miller was one of the first, taking the stand in her best floral dress and that simple dignity people of her generation carry naturally. She told about the last time she saw Mrs. Rose before the complete isolation, about how her friend was lucid, worried, obviously afraid of something but unable to fully articulate what. Rose wasn't senile, Teresa affirmed with absolute conviction when Brennan tried to suggest otherwise. She was one of the sharpest women I knew. She did New York Times crosswords every day, remembered everyone's birthdays in the neighborhood, could discuss politics with more clarity than most people half her age. Dementia? Complete nonsense. She knew exactly what was happening, and that's what scared her. The medical examiner testified about how the conditions described in Mrs. Rose's diary, lack of ventilation, denial of heart medications, extreme stress would have inevitably led to the heart failure that caused her death. With appropriate care and regular medication, Rose Turner could have lived another 5 perhaps 10 years, he said with professional firmness that couldn't completely hide his revulsion at what had happened. Her death was a direct consequence of the intentional negligence to which she was subjected. The handwriting expert showed, with enlarged slides, the obvious differences between Mrs. Rose's authentic signatures and Michael's forgery. Look here at the R in the name Rose. She always made a characteristic loop here. In the forgeries, this loop is completely absent or poorly executed. In the T in Turner, she always crossed it with a firm and slightly ascending line. In the forgeries, the line is hesitant, irregular. These are not signatures made by the same person. A forensic accountant detailed the financial transfers, showing with surgical precision how Michael had systematically drained Mrs. Rose's accounts, transferring money to his own accounts and then to Veronica, all while leaving his elderly mother's medical and house maintenance bills unpaid. He wasn't using her money to care for her, the accountant concluded. He was stealing to finance his double life, letting her literally die from lack of care while he spent tens of thousands of dollars on a secret family. And then it was my turn to testify. Daniel prepared me exhaustively for that moment, reminding me to answer only what was asked, not to let Brennan provoke me, to maintain composure no matter what happened. But when I took that stand, looked at the jury, 12 ordinary people who would hold Michael's fate in their hands, and I felt a strange calm invade me. Diana guided me through my testimony with gentleness, starting with basic questions about my relationship with Michael, about how we met, how our marriage was. I told the truth, all the truth I had suppressed for years. I talked about the psychological manipulation, about how he made me question my own sanity, about the gradual isolation from friends and family until I had no one but him. I talked about Mrs. Rose, about how she was the only person in Michael's life who treated me with genuine kindness, and about how he systematically limited my access to her, always with excuses that seemed reasonable at the time but that I now understood were part of a bigger plan. And then I told about finding the diary, about reading those devastating words, about discovering the room where she had been kept prisoner. I didn't need to dramatize anything. The truth was horrible enough on its own. Several people on the jury had tears in their eyes when I finished. But then it was Brennan's turn to interrogate me, and he wasn't gentle. "Mrs. Turner," he began, practically spitting my name. "You weren't happy in your marriage, were you? In fact, you had reasons to want revenge on my client. Isn't that true?" I took a deep breath, remembering Daniel's instructions. I wasn't happy because I was being emotionally and psychologically abused. And I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking justice for Mrs. Rose. He tried to make me look unstable, motivated by jealousy of Veronica, even suggested I could have forged the entire diary. But Daniel objected repeatedly, and Judge Thornton made it clear she wouldn't tolerate these tactics. When I finally stepped down from the stand, exhausted but with my head held high, I knew I had done justice to Mrs. Rose's memory. I had told her truth, and no one, no clever lawyer or manipulative argument, could change the facts. And then, on the 5th day of trial, something happened that no one expected. Veronica Hale was called to testify, and Michael, who until then had maintained that mask of outraged innocence, finally broke. When he saw the woman he loved, the mother of his son, taking the stand to testify against him, something in him shattered visibly. She told everything, every lie he told about me, about Mrs. Rose, about his life. She told about conversations where he complained his mother was interfering with his plans, where he said it would be much better for everyone when she finally departed. And when Brennan tried to suggest she was lying out of resentment, Veronica turned directly to Michael and said, with a voice that trembled but didn't waver, "I loved you. I raised my son believing you were a good man. And you used me, used our son, as an alibi, an excuse to torture your own mother to death? How do you sleep at night? How do you look in the mirror and recognize yourself?" Michael stood up abruptly, shouting, "All of this is her fault," pointing at me with a trembling finger. "Sarah poisoned everyone against me. The witch invented this whole story because she can't accept I found real happiness." The guards had to restrain him, forcing him to sit while the judge banged her gavel demanding order. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the real Michael Turner, the violent and uncontrolled man who hid behind charm and careful words. And in that moment, I knew the case was decided. No loyal performance could erase that demonstration of true character. The jury deliberations lasted only 7 hours. When they returned with the verdict, the tension in the courtroom was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Michael was pale, gripping the table in front of him hard enough for his knuckles to turn white. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman who vaguely reminded me of Mrs. Rose, stood up when requested. In the case of the state versus Michael James Turner, on the charge of second-degree homicide, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the room like thunder. Michael collapsed in his chair as if he'd been shot. On the charge of elder abuse resulting in death, we find the defendant guilty. On document forgery, guilty. On financial fraud, guilty. On unlawful imprisonment, guilty. Guilty on all charges. Judge Thornton thanked the jury and then turned to Michael with an expression that mixed revulsion and something that could be pity. "Mr. Turner, you will be sentenced in 2 weeks. Until then, you will remain in custody." And then she turned to me, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment, and nodded, a small but significant gesture that said justice has been done. I felt tears stream down my face, not from sadness, but from a relief so deep it seemed to empty me completely. It was over, really over. Michael Turner had been found guilty. Mrs. Rose, wherever she was, could finally rest in peace, and I could finally start breathing for real. 1 year later. It's strange how time works. Sometimes it seems to drag infinitely, especially during moments of pain, and other times it flies so fast you blink and an entire life has changed. Michael was sentenced to 15 years in prison without possibility of parole for the first 10. A sentence Judge Thornton made clear was insufficient to compensate for the suffering caused. But the maximum allowed by law. The divorce was finalized in record time. Daniel guaranteed I didn't end up with absolutely anything Michael had acquired through fraudulent, which meant I left the marriage with practically nothing materially, but with something infinitely more valuable: my freedom, my restored sanity, and a clear understanding that I was worth much more than that man had made me believe. Mrs. Rose's original will was restored by the court, recognizing she was in full mental faculties when she expressed the desire to leave me the house in Maple Creek, and that's where I returned, no longer as a visitor fleeing a nightmare, but as owner, as someone starting completely from scratch. The house that had witnessed so much horror was about to transform into something completely different, a symbol not of death and cruelty, but of rebirth and hope. The first months were difficult. I won't lie. Each room of that house carried memories, some sweet from when Mrs. Rose was alive and vibrant, others dark from the horrors I discovered. The room where she was kept prisoner haunted me particularly. I'd pass by that door and feel a weight in my chest, see ghosts that didn't exist but that my mind insisted on conjuring. Teresa, who had become not just a neighbor but the closest friend I had, found me crying in that hallway on a particularly difficult dish, hugging me with that surprising strength small elderly people sometimes have. You can't let that room continue being a tomb. You need to transform it into something that truly honors Rose, something that brings life instead of death. And that's how the idea was born. I couldn't just close that room and pretend it didn't exist. I needed to transform it into something something Mrs. Rose would have loved. So I decided to convert it into a small community library for children. Mrs. Rose always talked about how she loved reading, how books were portals to better worlds, especially when real life was difficult. What better way to honor her than creating a space where local children could discover that same love for reading? The physical transformation of the house took months of hard work. I hired a small team of local builders, men and women from Maple Creek, who knew Mrs. Rose and were horrified to discover what had happened to her. They worked not just for money, but for a sense of justice, wanting to restore something that had been defiled. We ripped out that cursed latch from the door, that symbol of imprisonment that made me feel nauseous every time I looked at it. We painted the walls a soft and welcoming yellow, installed bigger windows that flooded the space with natural light. Everything Mrs. Rose was deprived of in her final months of life, we guaranteed that space had in abundance. We built wooden shelves that went from floor to ceiling, designed by a local carpenter who refused to charge for the work, saying, "Only I do this for Rose." We placed colorful cushions on the floor, a soft rug where children could sit comfortably, and even a reading armchair near the window, the same armchair Mrs. Rose had in the living room, which I had reupholstered with a floral fabric she would have loved. And on the main wall, I installed a plaque, Rose Community Library, in memory of Rose Turner, who believed everyone deserves to escape to better worlds through the pages of a good book. The Maple Creek community embraced the project with an enthusiasm that caught me completely by surprise. People started donating books, not just old books they wanted to get rid of, but beautiful editions, emotional stories that had meaning to them and that they wanted to share. The town library organized a fundraiser and gave us more than 200 new children's books. A retired teacher volunteered to organize story time every Wednesday afternoon. Parents brought their children, initially curious about the house where that terrible thing happened, but soon forgetting the dark past while getting lost in adventures of pirates, princesses, astronauts, and dinosaurs. Seeing that room, that space of so much suffering, now filled with children's laughter, with little fingers turning pages, with excitement, with wide eyes discovering new worlds, was a form of healing I didn't know I needed. Mrs. Rose would have loved this. She would have sat in that armchair and read stories to each child, with that gentle smile I remembered so clearly. And in a way, through that library, her spirit continued doing exactly that, spreading joy, offering escape, showing children the world could be magical and wonderful, despite all its cruelty. The rest of the house also underwent gradual transformation. I restored the garden Mrs. Rose loved so much, pulling out the weeds that had taken over, planting new roses, of course roses, as she always said, laughing. A rose needs to be surrounded by roses and other flowers. I discovered were her favorites through conversations with Teresa. Each late afternoon, when the day's work was done, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and look at that blooming garden, and for the first time in years, maybe in my entire life, I felt true peace. Not the absence of problem, because life always has problems, but that kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you should be, doing exactly what you should do. The house stopped being a place of horror in my nightmares and became a true home, full of light, purpose, memories being created that slowly overwrote the old and painful ones. I started receiving visits from people who had followed the case through the media, other survivors of abuse, other people who had lost loved ones to neglect or family cruelty. We'd talk on the porch, share tea and stories, and slowly an informal healing community began to form around that house in Maple Creek. Veronica visited me once, a few months after the sentence. It was strange to see her cross that newly restored garden, hesitant, clearly not sure how she'd be received. Brian was with her. The boy had grown visibly since that terrible day in Crescent Hill, not physically, but emotionally, carrying on his shoulders the weight of discovering his father was a monster. I don't know if I should be here, Veronica said when she nervously wringing her hand. But I needed to see what you did with this place, and I needed Brian to understand who Rose really was. I looked at the boy, who observed me with dark eyes identical to his father's, but without that coldness, without that lack of empathy. There was pain there, confusion, but also something that seemed to be the beginning of understanding. "You're welcome here," I said, and I realized it was true. Veronica wasn't my enemy. She was another victim of Michael, another person deceived and hurt. I showed them the library, and I saw tears in Veronica's eyes when she read the plaque on the wall. "He told me so many lies about her," she whispered. Said Rose was cruel, problematic, that she didn't deserve consideration, and I believed him. God, how I believed. Brian, who had been silent, suddenly asked, "Was she nice, my grandmother?" The question, so simple and loaded with the need to find something good in such a dark story, made me kneel to be at his eye level. "Your grandmother was one of the kindest people I ever met," I told Brian, looking directly into those young eyes that needed so much to hear this. "She made the best apple pies, cared for a beautiful garden, and always had a smile and a kind word for everyone. She would have loved meeting you, would have spoiled you with homemade cookies and stories about when your father was a child, the good parts, before everything changed. It wasn't fair to burden that boy with details he wasn't ready to process, but he deserved to know he had come from something good, that there was kindness in his family tree even if his father had chosen a different path." Brian nodded slowly, absorbing those words as if they were water in a desert. Before leaving, he chose a book from the library, an adventure about pirates and hidden treasures, and asked timidly if he could borrow it. "Of course," I replied, pulling out a notebook where we recorded the loans, "and you can come back whenever you want." This library is for everyone, especially for you. It's part of your grandmother's legacy, and that means it's yours to when they left. I saw Veronica hold her son's hand a little tighter, and I knew they'd be okay. They'd be marked by this story. Of course, you don't come out unscathed from a revelation like that, but they'd survive. He'll find a way to move forward. Just as I was doing, the anniversary of Mrs. Rose's death fell on a sunny Tuesday in September. I organized a small ceremony in the garden. Nothing elaborate, just Teresa, Daniel, who had flown from Chicago, especially for the event, some neighbors who knew and loved Mrs. Rose, and surprisingly, a dozen children who regularly attended the library. We planted a special rose bush in the center of the garden, a variety called peace rose that produces color-changing flowers, starting yellow and gradually transforming to pink and even red on the edges. It seemed perfect, a symbol of transformation and hope. Each child had the chance to throw a handful of soil around the seedling, and then we read aloud a letter Mrs. Rose had written years ago, found among her belongings, where she described her life philosophy. I believe people are like gardens. We need light, water, nutrition, and care to flourish. And when we're neglected, when they keep us in the dark, we wither. But the most beautiful thing about plants and about people is that even after almost dying, if you restore the right conditions, they can come back to life. Resilience is our greatest quality as human beings. Never give up on flourish, no matter how long you spend in the darkness. Those words, written years before her own suffering, seem prophetic now. Mrs. Rose had understood deeply about survival, about hope, about the human capacity to recover even from the most terrible cruelty. That night, after everyone had left, I sat alone on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. I held a cup of tea. Mrs. Rose said tea solved almost everything, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to really reflect on everything that had happened, everything that had changed. A year ago, I was a broken woman, fleeing an abusive marriage, with no idea I was about to discover horrors that would change my life completely. It had been terrifying, painful, exhausting in ways words can barely capture. But it had also been liberating, discovering the truth about Michael, seeing his masks finally fall, witnessing justice being done. All of this had given me something I thought I'd lost forever. My voice, my strength, my capacity to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Mrs. Rose, even in deaths, had given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to become who I really was, free from the chains of manipulation and control. And I had honored that gift the only way that mattered, bringing justice, telling her story, guaranteeing her suffering wasn't forgotten or minimized. The ungrateful son, who should have loved her, was in prison. The total humiliation Michael tried to impose on all of us had turned completely against him, and the house that witnessed so much horror was now full of life, laughter, and hope. I raised my cup in a silent toast toward the darkening sky. "Thank you, Mrs. Rose," I whispered, my voice carried away by the gentle autumn breeze. "Thank you for trusting me, for leaving me this gift, for showing me it's possible to survive the darkness and still find light on the other side. I hope that, wherever you are, you can see what we did with your house, with your memory. I hope you know you didn't die in vain, that your story helped not just put a monster in prison, but gave courage to other people in similar situations to seek help, to get out, to survive." And in that moment, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt something I can only describe as presence, not ghostly or scary, but comforting, warm, like an invisible embrace. And I knew, with a certainty that can't be rationally explained, that Mrs. Rose was at peace, that she saw everything we had created in her name, and approved, that she could finally rest knowing justice had been done, that her story had meaning, that her suffering had led to something good and transformative. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of that clean and fresh Kentucky air, and for the first time since I could remember, I felt completely, totally, perfectly free. The emotional story that began with horror and revelation had ended with rebirth and hope. And as long as the Rose Community Library continued opening its doors to children seeking adventures in the pages of books, as long as that garden continued flourishing with roses of all colors, the memory of Rose Turner, not as victim, but as the strong, kind, and resilient woman she really was, would live forever. And that, in the end, was the only justice that really mattered. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't had the courage to enter that house. If I had simply let the past stay buried and moved on, pretending nothing had happened, Mrs. Rose would have become just another statistic, another elderly woman who died alone and was forgotten. Michael would continue his double life, destroying more people, accumulating more victims, and I would continue being that broken woman, always questioning my own reality, always feeling small and worthless. But life doesn't work with what-ifs. It works with the choices we make in decisive moments. When everything inside us screams to run, but something, maybe courage, maybe just desperation, makes us stay and fight. Mrs. Rose gave me a gift in her final moments of lucidity, the truth, and I honored that gift by doing exactly what she asked, justice. Today, when I look at the Rose Community Library full of children laughing and discovering new worlds, when I see that blooming garden she loves so much, I know I transformed pain into something beautiful, horror into hope. And if this story touched your heart in some way, if you saw part of yourself in it, I want you to know you're also stronger than you imagine. You can also survive the darkness and find light on the other side. And have you been through something similar? Do you know someone who's trapped in a relationship where manipulation and control disguise cruelty? What would you do if you were in Mrs. Rose's place or in my place? Sometimes it's harder than we imagine to recognize when we're being victims, when what we call love is actually imprisonment. Tell your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear they're not alone, that there's a way out, that there's hope, even when everything seems completely dark. If this story touched your heart, if you felt every emotion with me, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. Each story I share here is a reminder that we're stronger than we imagine, that justice is possible, and that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for rebirth. Let's go together on this journey of stories that matter, that transform, that make us feel deeply human. Until the next story,